Review 1. Bill Moyer, historian.
Lyndon Johnson was no racist, but he had not been a civil rights hero either. Now, as president, he came down on the side of civil disobedience, believing it might quicken America's conscience until the cry for justice became irresistible, enabling him to turn Congress. So King marched, and Johnson maneuvered, and Congress folded.
President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended segregation in public places. But they weren't done. King kept on marching, this time for the right to vote. And once again, Johnson kept his word and did the right thing. As one of his young assistants, I stood on the floor of the House that Ides of March when morality and politics converged, and I watched the faces of Congress transfixed, mesmerized, knowing they were riding the surf of history as the President of the United States enlisted all of us in the cause.
It's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
As he finished, Congress stood, and thunderous applause shook the chamber. Johnson would soon sign into law the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and black people were no longer second-class citizens. Martin Luther King had marched and preached and witnessed for this day. Countless ordinary people had put their bodies on the line for it, been berated, bullied, and beaten, only to rise, organize, and struggle on against the dogs and guns, the bias and burning crosses. Take nothing from them. Their courage is their legacy. But take nothing from the president, who once had seen the light but dimly as through a dark glass, and now did the right thing. Lyndon Johnson threw the full weight of his office on the side of justice. Of course, the movement had come first, watered by the blood of so many, championed bravely now by the preacher turned prophet who would himself soon be martyred. But there is no inevitability to history. Someone has to seize and turn it. With these words, at the right moment, we shall overcome. Lyndon Johnson transcended race and color, and history too, reminding us that a president matters, and so do we.
This clip already has a conclusion, so it doesn't have to be talked about. However, we will be talking about what the experts say in later clips. Review number 2, John Moeller, political science professor at Luther College.
He was a politician in the sense of wanted to bring about change. He liked power. He knew how to use power. And so there was almost the adrenaline flow of this has got to be done and I'm going to do it. It wasn't just raw politics. It wasn't just raw legacy. He knew that this was the right thing to do, the good thing to do, and knew he could make it happen. And I think all that comes together probably to help explain what drove him and caused him to...
This shows LBJ was powerful and used his power for good. Review number 3, Robert Caro, author of biographies about LBJ.
Back on this transformation theme, so he becomes president through no actions of his own. There is this boiling resentment, there is this grief which overcomes all of the members of the Kennedy inner circle, and yet here comes the Texan to take over. And in his first speech to a joint session of Congress, what does he do? He decides to take on civil rights.
Yes, he says the most important thing we can do is pass the civil rights bill that Jack Kennedy introduced and fought for so long. And he picks up this bill. You know, at the time that Kennedy was assassinated, at the moment he was assassinated, his two top priority bills, civil rights and tax cuts, are really dead in the water in Congress. Congress has stopped him. the Southerners control, I think it's 9 of the 16 great standing committees of the Senate. They control the Senate absolutely. The Civil Rights Bill hasn't even gotten over to the Senate. It's in the House Rules Committee, which is ruled over by Judge Howard W. Smith of Virginia. And he's refusing even to tell anybody when he'll get to have hearings on the Civil Rights Bill. Johnson, you know, Johnson was a genius. He was a legislative genius. He remembers that a Representative Richard Bowling of Missouri has introduced a discharge petition to take the bill away from Smith's committee. Now, these petitions seldom go anywhere, and a president is never behind them because it's challenging all the House prerogative. Johnson makes a call to Bowling, and you have to say the first half of the call is Johnson saying, "I'll never interfere with the House prerogatives." Then he says to Bowling, "Do you see any other way to get this out of committee?" Bowling says no. And I wrote in the book, if there was only one lever, Lyndon Johnson was going to push it. And to watch him push that discharge petition through and get the Civil Rights Bill is legislative genius.
It's the old Lyndon Johnson that we know from Master of the Senate, your last book, and
Yes.
it's him come back. But and in it, he also says, you quote him as saying to Doris Kearns Goodwin, the historian, "I had to take the dead man's program and turn it into the martyr's cause."
Yes. And he uses the sympathy that people had for Kennedy. That helped him get the bills moving. But he also uses his great knowledge of legislative techniques and the secrets of the Senate to get these bills moving.
And in the next book, we will hear about what brought him down, and that's the war in Vietnam.
Very dark story.
Very dark
Sad
story. But we look forward to reading it, Robert Carroll. Thank you so much.
In this clip, we can see that LBJ pushed for many acts and laws that he thought was right. However, in order to do this, he must both have the skill and the courage to push for these acts to be passed. Review number 4, Doris Kearns Goodwin, biographer about LBJ.
He told me that his mother loved him greatly, but always made him feel that unless he kept succeeding, she would withdraw love from him. If he came home with a bad report card, for instance, she would actually pretend that he had died. She would sit at the dinner table and say to her husband and his brother, "Isn't it too bad Lyndon has gone from us?" And that's a pretty severe statement to make somebody feel that unless I keep succeeding, there's not going to be anything for me there. The part I remember most is that the man I saw in those last years in his retirement was really a desolate man because he was out of power, had absolutely no interests to keep him going once the presidency was gone. So that retirement was almost like a little death for him. He'd wake up in the morning and really not even know how to get through the days. And I think what it convinced me of more than anything was that that kind of success bought at that price isn't worth it unless you have other things to balance you. He had no hobbies, no interest in sports. His family loved him, but they couldn't fill the hole in him that he needed to be filled by the applause of millions. So he almost willed himself to die in those last years. He so wanted more people to go through the Johnson Library, then we're going through the Kennedy Library in Boston, that after a while he used to have them free donuts, coffee, anything, get them in there. And after a while, the librarians, knowing how much it mattered to him, used to have a clicker, so they would click themselves in and out over and over again just to give him an escalated count at the end of the week. So I think the experience taught me more than anything that if your ambition comes at the price of such an unbalanced life, that there's nothing else that gives you comfort but success, it's not worth it. And to see that at 23 years old was an incredibly invaluable lesson, because I think at that time you think work's the most important thing in your life and fame and success are what you're dreaming of. And yet to be able to know that if it's bought at that high a price, as I said, it's not worth it. I will always be grateful for that lesson.
In this clip, we can see that LBJ tried hard. In fact, he tried so hard to make his legacy, it caused his downfall. Review number 5, Jeff Sheshel, author of a biography about LBJ. Review number 6. Mark Updegrove, author of a biography about LBJ.
The two were completely different. John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson were fundamentally different human beings. And I think that LBJ was keenly aware that he was succeeding somebody who was so graceful and who was almost set an impossible standard by which to be measured, partly because of his martyrdom. But Liz Carpenter, who worked for Mrs. Johnson, worked for both of the Johnsons, and was kind of the Dorothy Parker of the political set in the 1960s, I think encapsulated the differences between the two men very eloquently. She said that, I think that presidents can be summed up in one word: Kennedy inspired, which Johnson was incapable of doing, and Johnson delivered. And I think that's absolutely true. If John F. Kennedy, in my view, begs to be judged by his words. He's so inspiring, he's so eloquent, he's so visionary. Ask not what your country could do for you. Ich bin ein Berliner. We choose the moon. And Johnson begs to be judged by his deeds, what he accomplished, what he did. He wasn't telegenic. He wasn't particularly graceful as a media personality. But he delivered. He knew how to get things done. And if you look at his legislative record, this is a formidable president, and probably the most important president legislatively in my lifetime. And look at the full sweep of the Great Society and how it resonates today. It is absolutely remarkable. You know, I think that the challenge that a biographer has in capturing Lyndon Johnson is he is so enormously complex. And the way that I ensured that this was even-handed and balanced, which I think a lot of the...
A friend of mine and of Harry's and Shirley's is named Bob Hardesty, and he was a speechwriter like Harry for Lyndon Johnson. And I think he put it very aptly when he said, allowing for shades of subtlety, there were as many LBJs as there were people who knew him. And as often as not, the people they saw were contradictory. And I think that says so much about LBJ. He treated everybody differently, because I think Hubert Humphrey called him the world's best psychologist. He understood how to get people who mattered to say yes, and that meant treating people in very different ways. So that's why I think that one of the reasons that people saw him so differently from person to person.